Good morning and welcome back to the Flagship Studio at the 2026 JPMorgan Healthcare Conference. I'm Justine Levin-Allerhand, Executive Partner at Flagship Pioneering. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel co-hosted with the Gates Foundation on Women's Health, a fast-going frontier for innovation and investment. I'm joined by my fellow panelists, Nisha Nanda, Group Vice President of Business Development and Head of Catalyze 360 at Eli Lilly and Company, Misti Ushio, Managing Partner at Digitalis Ventures, and Anita Zaidi, President of Gender Equity Division of the Gates Foundation. Before I turn to our conversation, I just want to level set and frame the conversation that when we're referring to women's health here today, we're not only speaking about sexual and reproductive health, we're describing and talking about the horizontal across medicine, spanning conditions that uniquely affect women, diseases that disproportionately burden them, and of course, manifest differently across men and women. So we need to think about that as the collective. And given the vast space that I just described, it should come as no surprise to all of you and to our audience that the opportunity for women's health is enormous. And I think the challenge has been is that the whole field has been plagued by scientific uncertainty and investment uncertainty, really resulting perhaps in an underfunded sector. So what we want to talk about today is how do we break that open? How do we ensure that female-specific conditions, both inside oncology, outside of oncology, sexually based differences, are all addressed effectively to turn the tide on women's health? So I'm going to start the conversation by just opening for each of you from where you sit, whether it be in the philanthropic area, in pharma, in venture, or in other perspectives that you may have. What have been the barriers to date? And what's been misunderstood about women's health such that it is not viewed as a key place for innovation and for investment? Anyone like, Nisha, like to start?
Sure. So I think you addressed one point already. I think on the oncology side, we've got great medicines. We have deep research. There's so much innovation going on across academia, biotech, pharma, philanthropy in oncology. And I think that's driven by the fact that it is collectively understood. Mm-hmm. We have collectively worked hard to identify targets, endpoints, biomarkers to drive a difference. Mm-hmm. I think what's happened is we have not done the same focus on other women health specific diseases or conditions. And many of them, I think we're going to talk about today, just haven't had that attention paid to them. Or there's been policy changes, or there's been waxing and waning on funding from all kinds of different reasons. It just hasn't had the focus that it deserved. And so I think that's what's happened, and what's super exciting is actually the tide has changed because of many factors, including social media, that's really helped. And so I think we're all very excited to think about the future and make the same changes that we did on oncology to be reflected in women-related conditions across the board.
Yeah, good. I think, and I'll probably talk more about this later, but really thinking about the return on investment, and I think part of the challenge is that because we've underinvested in women's biology, so for instance, understanding causes and the biological underpinning for endometriosis, for example, while it affects 1 in every 10 women, which is shocking, to actually run a clinical trial is very difficult because as pain as the endpoint, because we don't have the biology, it's really hard to quantify as an investment how that looks. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that because of the underinvestment in research, we're actually in a more investment risk situation right now, and I think we need to think about ways to sort of bridge that gap through regulatory and other ways.
Great. Anita, first impression.
Yeah, so you asked Justine about what's misunderstood about the sector, and from where I sit, I'm the president of gender equality at the Gates Foundation, and when I had the opportunity to say, okay, what are the areas, because this was a new division that was set up that I became the first president for. When I had the opportunity to sort of look at what is the best return on investment, and then we're talking about investment in terms of lives saved and lives improved, this area screamed out, right? Because there is just so much underinvestment in women's health R&D and such a target-rich environment that just the opportunity to make incredible impact in a very short time span span was huge. But what I found was misunderstood was that people think of this as a social impact issue, right? Whereas it's actually a commercial opportunity because the demand out there, the scale of the problem globally is so huge. And that we are increasing understanding how sex as a biological variable, even in issues which are not unique to women, like conditions like cardiovascular disease, obesity, asthma, we were just talking about, have huge differences between the sexes, and unless you understand them and go after that untapped market, you're missing lots of value on the table. So that's one part of it. The other part that I find is misunderstood is the risk. Right, so people will often say, especially investors, pharma, that it's a very uncertain, risky field. We don't really know. That basic biology information is missing. But I find that is actually very easy for. Why am I here as a Gates Foundation person? For a philanthropy to like step in and solve those questions very quickly, because we've already set up a lot of the platforms that can answer these questions, like biomarkers, endpoint, like you're saying, endometriosis. Pain is not a good endpoint for a clinical study. So, what are biomarkers that you could have? And I find that that's a fantastic space for philanthropy to, catalyze early investment. And we're looking forward to working with industry and biotech and investors to actually unlock the field.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is, as a field, it may be viewed as it's insurmountable, there's so much unknown, but if we could create the unlocks, whether it be the scientific unlocks, as was done in cancer over many decades, that made it very easy to come in both scientifically and from an investment standpoint, as well as really seeing what can be tractable, that again will allow us to immediately follow in as a community, again across philanthropy that could be helping with the unlocks, as well as pharma and venture, et cetera. So thanks for that initial perspective that I think will be a grounding for this conversation. So I'd love to turn back, Anita, to what you're speaking to. Last August, the Gates Foundation announced a remarkable $2.5 billion commitment to women's health R&D. And I want to emphasize the R&D. I want to hear from you. And so as you think about that opportunity over the next 5 years, what then do you see as the business case that can follow from that extraordinary philanthropic investment and commitment, both dual market opportunities, global to local opportunities, and how does the foundation see essentially the link between the philanthropic dollars to the private dollars in a seamless way that will allow us to really fill that pipeline of activity as seamlessly as possible?
Yeah, so two things, Justine. One is, so it's $2.5 billion over the next 5 years for R&D in women's health. People think that we are, our main focus is the developing world where we're trying to save lives and improve lives. But there's actually, women's health is one of those areas where whatever we do in developing countries, because the problem is so huge, is actually very applicable also to higher income environments, because you're really forced to innovate in a way that is simplifies the solutions that you're trying to come with. So affordability becomes a big issue that you focus on. So when everybody in this room, I make evidence-based decisions. That's what the foundation is about. And so I'm looking at, the scale of the problem is huge. Demand is huge globally. There are many, many dual market opportunities where if I pick up that area, because there is a translatability to high-income countries. So I'll just name a few. We won't have time to go into why I think those, but preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, moving fetal monitoring so that you can prevent baby being damaged or dead into the AI age from the dark ages, which is, there's just been no advance in fetal monitoring for the last several decades. And there's so much advance in sensor technology that you really need to be able to do. You can do better. Non-hormonal contraception has been an area that we have actively invested in. We have a fantastic partnership with Bayer, where we funded all of the basic science. So now they have a preclinical candidate ready to go. Vaginal microbiome, huge problem in the US as well, vaginal dysbiosis. And finally, point-of-care ultrasounds, where for women's health conditions and primary care conditions, AI-enabled primary care ultrasound, you really don't need a skilled reader. These can be frontline worker tools or even home tools eventually.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know what we didn't, you mentioned, which I love, is this notion of global to local, to say, you know, when capital is scarce, and how does innovation come in to try to create those solutions? Then how do we bring those solutions from, you know, a scarce environment to other environments and ensure that we really are able to quickly commercialize and quickly enable?
Maybe I can make one quick point. It's like, you know, so in many areas of women's health, actually, you can be in the pre-competitive space to really build the ecosystem there, which I like for non-hormonal contraception was one area like that, where we started we got all of the people who are interested, including from the regulatory side, and say like, what does the field need to actually develop? So you could actually pick up a category of women's health, like preeclampsia, for example, and really take it forward like that, just first initially in the pre-competitive space, getting everybody to work together until you're at that commercial stage where then people, whoever is interested, can take that deal forward.
Yeah, great. So Nisha, I would love to actually double click on what you highlighted in the opening. You know, large pharma has seen categories like immunology, I mean cancer for sure, but even areas, you know, immunological diseases that have gone from kind of backwater science into scaled commercial opportunities. And so, you know, what have been, you know, when you think about women's health, what would the field need to demonstrate to actually then go from something that's largely, you know, not touched significantly, not addressed significantly, to something that is on the top of every pipeline? And of course, women's cancers matter, but there are a whole host of diseases that disproportionately affect women that we know are, you know, problematic, and, you know, as it relates to sexual and reproductive health. How do those rise to the top from a pharma perspective? What needs to be true? What needs to be proven? And what can actually just be unlocks that we can just go after together?
Yeah, immunology actually is a really good example, because while it's heterogeneous, like there's so many immunological diseases and all kinds of organs are impacted by that, they're very clearly defined measurable endpoints, right? That obviously gives you the regulatory ability to talk to regulators globally, right? They understand what you're trying to measure. The physicians understand what you're trying to measure. You design your trials measuring those endpoints. You have biomarkers that you develop as you're going along. And then that gives you like a rubric to work into. So that's like at the top level. And then when you get to commercial stage, you have those same endpoints on your labels. The physicians then give you the patients the medicines, and they know what they're doing. The roadmap is already presented. We don't have that in women's health. So that's at the top level. Then as you go lower, or earlier, more into what's going on, we really have spent decades understanding the research in immunology, and we're moving into all new areas even within immunology. Like we're now trying to understand genetically defined immunological populations. We haven't done any of that in women's health. We have all the tools available, to your point. We have all the omics, we have all the AI. Like we literally have to enable, we need to tell the story that we are already collectively, we need to collect the data to define endpoints so the regulators know that we know what we're measuring. We know that they can rely on those endpoints, that then we can have drugs approved and then we can commercialize them. So the entire sort of life cycle needs to come together the same way immunology came together, as well as in other therapeutic areas. Even though it's heterogeneous, like to my point, like PCOS is not going to be the same as preeclampsia and neither endometriosis. They're all going to have different endpoints. They're going to have different stages that hits women's lifetimes in, and then there's all the other chronic conditions we all know about as well, that will all have, again, different endpoints, but they need to be defined, created, be able to be measured, and there need to be biomarkers. So there's just a lot of work we need to do together.
Yeah, and just to bridge, Anita, what you were describing, and Nisha, what you're describing is, you know, are there also pre-competitive environments where we could actually understand the genetics of women versus men for certain diseases?
Yes.
Can we then feed that into patient segmentation for clinical trials, as well as then the clinical endpoints? You use that, you know, as we look at the outcomes. So how to think about, again, creating that scientific through line, so that way when we need to go to a clinical trial, we have all those pieces that we could draw from.
Yeah, and just leaning back on oncology just for one more second again, like BRCA, like, I mean, we didn't know anything about that, and now it's, you know, it's a standard measurement, you know, we do for families, or, you know, we all know how that works out in breast cancer, but it's incredible, right? That didn't exist even a few decades ago,
Right.
and look where it is today.
So enormous
Yeah.
progress. So the good news is there are roadmaps, there are tools, there are capabilities, there are ways that we can get to that end state. We just need to now think about how to translate a roadmap into action.
Yeah.
So Misti, you want to really take the investment, kind of VC investment lens. So when does a women's health company cross the line from something that's promising to investable? We talk about what makes it, attractive for pharma to advance an asset. But if you're as someone coming to you and with a women's health company, what are the barriers that prevent progress for them at each stage of funding? Because you're seeing things at all different stages. And are there ecosystem level changes that would help, that would make across many companies the real change from something that's more investable?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as investors, we're pretty simple people. Like, we say, how much can I sell this investment for at some point in time? And, talking to CEOs, and I'd like 2 years, 5 years, whatever. But like, how much? Like, quantify the value. And then how much investment, how much capital is it going to take to get from today to that value, whatever it is, in 2 or 5 or 10 years, whatever it is. And what's the pre-money valuation? And so you do the quick math, which is pre-money valuation plus new capital invested. That has to be smaller than the value at exit. And this is nothing to do with women's health. This is just like investors are looking at each investment with what is the return on investment. And so if you start to unpack that for women's health, the value and time, I think you can get your head around that with the right research, with the right partnerships in pharma, understanding the public markets and the comps and what other companies are doing and how they get valued by different investors. But I think what's harder in women's health than say in other disease areas or just other spaces is that sometimes it's really hard to quantify how much it's going to cost to get to that value because of some of these issues around lack of biology, lack of education, maybe regulatory hurdles that don't need to be there, maybe coding or a CMS where you can't get paid, maybe on the more on the diagnostic side or other things. And so, again, as an investor, you're like, if 1 or 2 of those things are blocking or in a deal, it's going to be hard. Like if you've got 3 or 4, it's really hard. And so I think just maybe a short story on how I started personally, started spending a lot of time in women's health is it started through ARPA-H and their Sprint for Women's Health, but then also kind of in the previous administration when they asked for $12 billion from Congress in women's health, there was a call from the White House that said, can you help me understand private capital? They're like, what if we get all this? And this was not me. This is a friend of mine who is in policy, and she calls me and she's like, can you come help me teach them about private capital? Because they don't, it's like there's the different slices. And so what started as kind of how to educate sort of public money on private capital and how there's like the seed and venture and turned into this like research project where I talked to a lot of CEOs, a lot of investors, and just asked them 3 questions, like what's working in women's health investment, what's blocking investment, and can policy help? And it turned into this like really interesting research project that sort of said, hey, there's a push from government, again at the time, but there's a pull from industry, like you want to have these products. And there's this like, where's venture in this? And then unpacking like these things I mentioned that were these consistent themes that kept coming over and over. And so for me, it's like, how do you try to solve some of that next layer? Because it's not just money. It's not just more money isn't like going to unlock it. It's these other pieces. So I think that's what, as an investor, like those are the things that keep coming up over and over again. And I try to think about like, how does the whole ecosystem, not just the venture capital ecosystem, work together to solve some of these. And we've heard some good examples around groups coming together to talk to the FDA and not about a specific product, but about kind of general themes that, if we can work together, that might like unlock some of this. So that's kind of kind of what I see.
Great. Yeah. So I want to actually pull on the pull. So Nisha, obviously from where you sit, you're exposed to a lot. What are the elements of pull? You talk about the clinical endpoints, et cetera, but if some of those things are not there right now, what are other things that could create pull from your perspective among your pharma colleagues that really can help change and enable us to do more push at the earlier stages? Because it really is a pull that we need.
I know, it's such a good question. We keep feeling we're stuck in this little catch-22. But I think if you think about it, even some good models, like just some great models that a lot of us pharma companies have many drugs in the pain space in our freezers that we can screen against models, right? But if then models don't exist, then how are we going to do that? So if there could even be the most basic sort of depth of research done in specific areas, and I'm just going to use endometriosis as an example yet again. Like if there are more models like that we can screen lots of compounds in, and then we can create there from that. You take, it's one step at a time, and then we start to engage with all our philanthropy colleagues on the other conversations, the next set of conversations with the regulators. So as we're designing the trials with the physicians, like what are we trying to measure, get agreement on endpoints that they're willing to look at and things like that, we can make headway there. But we still need this bottom layer of work to be done. And again, that comes back to all the super smart people that work in academia and work in biotech to fuel that. And we do a good job in pharma on biology, but I would say, I think most of you folks in the audience will agree, a lot of the sort of creative biological thinking and target thinking comes from academia and biotech, right? And we're big enablers of it, but we rely very deeply on that. So that would be my big push, and if we can help that, and then people can come up with ideas and come to us and tell us ways we can help there, we're open.
Yeah, great. Anita, any comment there? Because I think you've done some of that work.
Very much agree with Nisha. So this is where philanthropy can really play a role, is in this improving the biological like just the basic fundamentals of the field, and including investing in models and data, even patient data, understanding how biomarkers and endpoints can be defined. Another place that you mentioned, Justine, is on the regulatory side, where if there's a condition, for example, that has no treatment, and the regulation is such that it's really a barrier to the field. Preeclampsia is one example where the guidance from FDA is so high bar for what they would allow that, there's just no interest from the pharma and biotech world that you could actually, instead of company by company, a neutral person or neutral entity can approach them and say, hey, here's what we see as a very big barrier in the field, and how can we work together to really better define what it is that we can do to have biomarker-based clinical trials and things like that. So there's a lot to do in the field, and it's very exciting to be in this situation where there is interest and increasing momentum and recognition of the opportunity that a first mover, whether from philanthropy or from the private sector side, can really make a huge impact.
Yeah, but what I'm also hearing is, are there a couple of disease areas where we know some of the genetics, we have models, we have some mechanism of action, we have some early targets and chemistry. So are there some examples that then again creates a sense of how we can go end to end, and of course have partnership with regulatory.
Yeah. So quick example is on the non-hormonal contraceptives. Where we started on that was actually scanning the field for genetic variability in fertility, right? And identifying genetic markers of infertility, where everything else was normal but that one thing. And those were great druggable targets, right? Reversible druggable targets. That's where we started with funding academia. And then companies got in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, what I'm particularly excited about also is ensuring that, of course, we care about sexual and reproductive health, but ensuring that we carry the other two buckets. So, you know, diseases that disproportionately affect women and women presenting differently than men.
Absolutely.
And genetics will be part of that, and you know, and mechanism of action, but really making sure we tackle those pieces.
Add something to that, just because one thing that I don't think I've seen this data, and if it exists, I'd love to see it, but we always throw this number out, like 2%, only 2% is going to women's health of investment. And
Outside of oncology.
Yeah, outside. But I don't think we include migraine, Alzheimer's, osteoporosis in that number. And I wonder if we sort of took the definition that we're using, which is those three buckets you talked about, and then really like, you know, added up the total investment in those areas. I bet that 2% would be like much higher. And because some of it's perception on when those sort of statistics come out, and it's like, oh, 2%, it must be small, or it must be like, there's just like these things that go off in your brain.
Right, and then self-reinforcing that it must not be investable because it's a small number.
Talking about it being like a much broader, you know, category because of these, especially like, you know, like Alzheimer's is a great example, migraine's a great example, just things that disproportionately affect women. But we're not calling them women's health. We're not calling migraine investment in women's health. And so I think we could kind of reframe the numbers a little bit to sort of match how we're talking about it, and there's a little bit of a lag there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's true, and you know, and that's that we know that we need to define that, we need to make that clear. So you know, as we think about you know, heading into 2026, or in 2026, heading into the next handful of years, you know, would love to you know, get a sense from you is, you know, what's a signal, whether it be scientific, commercial, or societal, that makes you optimistic right now? Again, I think everyone on this panel has been in the women's health space for many years. You know, what's the pivot point right now that you think about? And how do we ensure that we harness that most effectively as, you know, we're now in January of 2026 and into the next year, 2, 3 years?
I just think the time is right. I think there's just all these forces had to come together to make women's health front in the conversation. I don't remember JP Morgan when it's been like this. We touched on it a little bit last year, but this year we're like a lot more, you know, vocal about it. And I think we need to keep doing this, like collectively across industry, and all our parts of industry come together to define what are we trying to solve, and pick some areas that we need to make some noise in to focus it. I also think that, you know, at least at Lilly, like internally, we are super interested. We have teams stood up, fully ready. We're going through our own freezers, talking about bone health. You know, Lilly used to be in osteoporosis, and you know, the FDA did such a huge, you know, announcement recently by allowing new endpoints, which is, to your point, fuel the field. There's so much more investment now in osteoporosis. Everyone is thinking so deeply about it. Signals like that really do fuel the next stage of assets coming through. So I think, I don't know, we are ready. What my thing is like is more to everyone to, and it's not just Lilly. I guarantee almost every pharma is thinking about this. We recognize it, and we're all ready, and I think people should talk to us. And so we're prepared.
Great.
That's where we are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of momentum.
Misti, any what's the signal that makes you optimistic? I mean,
to follow on, I mean, the conversations are just there's just more of them. They're richer. We're starting to, I don't think we're getting stuff done yet, but I think we're talking about getting stuff done. Like there's just a lot of momentum for me. I'm just like, how do we make sure we don't lose that? Second, though, I think women are taking way more charge of their health than they used to. I think women are frustrated with healthcare, and I mean, I'm in my 50s, and all we talk about is menopause. And so, like, that whole conversation and that dialogue, just by talking about it, brings awareness. It creates businesses. There's so much opportunity, and a lot of it is societal. A lot of it's just kind of how we act as a community. That are we create our own barriers sometimes, but I do think direct-to-consumer products in women's health is what's growing right now, and I think it's because women are saying, you know what, I'm just going to go get it myself. I'm going to figure it out, and I'm just going to like make my own decisions. I'm going to spend my money where I want to spend it, and I think people should pay attention to that because I do think. And I think people should ask women what they want. I think people tend to ask physicians, or they ask other people, and I think women are feeling more empowered about their health, and I think that's a great, to your point, moment in time. Like,
Yeah.
I think I'd add, so I agree with those, and I'd add that finally it seems like women's health is becoming a mainstream topic. It's not seen as a niche area anymore. I think a lot of the GLP-1s, which are many more women are using GLP-1s than men, have also kind of made the investment opportunity clearer to pharma and industry. So that I think is we're not there totally. I mean, there's a lot to do, as we discussed, but I think we're getting there, and that makes me optimistic.
So we talked about in the beginning things that are misunderstood in women's health, and I think we did a lot in unpacking. If you were advising someone who's either a founder of a company or going after new assets, or they were entering women's health, again, what would you advise them to ensure that they don't get dissuaded or disheartened by where things are at? What's the way to actually rally and bring people in? We talked about a lot of things. What would you advise that person?
So one of the teams that I have is a venture investing team. We invest in funds as well as directly in companies, and we're strategic investors. So our job is really to enable. We're not doing this to have a financial outcome. It's more like, can we be present at the table? Can we be available to companies to think through their science? Can they come to us early and build trust with us? And the companies we engage with is where we feel the science is high quality. And so what does that mean in women's health? Like, we do need companies to come with deep scientific thinking and rationale. Like this omics topic we just talked about, and you gave a great example about the non-hormonal birth control and things like that. Like if you have a science hypothesis, spend the time to develop the science. Because people like us will engage in science. And that's what we're here for. We're believers. Medicines, all the best medicines come from the deepest science. And so that's what I feel like from my seat, that's what I want to see when a company comes. Like, where is your science? How have you de-risked it? And I'm not saying you have to be like very complicated, but like sometimes genetic markers are a great way to start. Is there some sort of biomarker thinking you have there? Is there, like I already mentioned multiple times, some kind of model that you can look at and show us that we can screen through and follow along with you? So for me, that would be my big advice is like spend the time to do a deep analysis of your science, spend the time like working through that and tell a good story.
Yeah, tell a good story and tell a clear story.
And a clear story.
Yeah. No, and that ties into what you were highlighting before, Misti, where it's clear that the opportunity is there, but has it been framed? Is it clear what we're actually talking about? Yeah. And I think we've had prior conversations around even just again defining what women's health is and ensuring that it's known and understood.
Yeah, I mean, I again, this is more general than just women's health, but now I've seen so many pitches over like 20 years, but I usually kind of like, I'm just going to assume it works. Like, I'm just going to assume your technology works. Explain to me what your business is, and explain to me like how that is going to, I get the problem solution. And the two pieces that I think people miss sometimes or frequently is this ROI. I talked enough about it, but like there's articulating that is really important. And the other thing I think, there's always this idea like if it works, they will come. And if it works, you will make money. If it works, the physicians will use it. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think sometimes missing kind of like, again, the ROI piece, but also missing like, how do physicians, or there's the buyer and the user, and they're not always the same person. And so just what is that like, really entrenched practice in a hospital? Like, will you really able to? So those are the things that I like to kind of double down on and really try to unpack for people. And I think that's, the more you think about that, the better off you're going to be.
I take, So women's health, as we've discussed, it's very diverse, right? There's just a lot. There's conditions that are uniquely women face. There's conditions that are, where sex differences make a very big difference. And all of these are in different stages of development. So I don't want to leave the audience with a thing is that everything is needs deep science, right? There are some pretty ready to go areas as well. And one of the examples I'll give you, taking up your thing, is a company called Pomelo. I don't know if you're aware of them. So they basically, their idea was that they would take preeclampsia, they would take pregnancy, and they have a app, so the digital company that is being used by women who are Medicaid eligible, so rural populations. They have 25 million women in their platform now, and what they're doing and how they're making money is they pick up preeclampsia early. They get those women on aspirin, and it's a huge cost saving because those moms are not delivering premature babies that then end up in the NICU. So it's a huge cost saving to the system. So they're saving lives, and they're saving money to the system, and they're making money, right? So there's ideas like that out there for people to look at that are ready to go. Okay.
Yeah, great. At Flagship, we always take a future back view, where we imagine a future with precision, maybe not with accuracy, because you need to let time play out, but with precision. And having that future view with precision actually allows us to build transformative bioplatform companies. So would love, in the last question, for all of us together to imagine what a future would look like. So if we were sitting here, it's now 2026, the beginning of 2026, if we were sitting here in 2030, what's a future back view of women's health? What would be, what do you imagine, what do you want to see happen should be the conversation at that point, knowing where we are today and knowing all of the various angles that we covered today? Take that future, go into the future with me, and who'd like to start?
Yeah, maybe someone else can start.
I can start, because I think about that a lot. So I'll take the 2045 view, which is,
I think I'll take 2045.
Yeah, but then I'll come back to 2030. I think many of you will know that we made an announcement that we will sunset in 20 years. So now 2045 becomes a very important year for us. So then we're looking at, okay, how do you accelerate so that you can, so our goal one at the foundation is no preventable moms and babies deaths in the world. So that's my future, 2045. Very ambitious. In practice, what it means is we want to halve everything, right? Halve everything from what it is today in 20 years. So I'm very committed to looking at the opportunity scape, the landscape out there, and saying what is it that gets us there? Okay, so that's also on the newborn side, not just on mom's side, but it's all related, because newborns do badly if moms do badly. Right. But in the 5-year time frame, I think we can really unlock the science for many of the conditions that we care about that are big time conditions, right? And so that's where I'm looking at, okay, can we have hubs of innovation around the world, where you really you've established the platforms, whether they're clinical platforms, basic science platforms, translational platforms, to just really accelerate timelines.
So really turn the tide on these fields. Exactly. That way we have just a lot more information as a substrate to build from.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so and partnerships. And so I'm looking for anybody who's interested in partnerships. Please, I have people over here.
And that ecosystem and that network. And how do we ensure that network is strong with all the key nodes and reinforcing those nodes, as you highlighted, within the U.S., but of course globally.
Correct, yes.
I just like two things. One is I met this organization recently, and they have a variety of different pools of money for women's health. And one was that they have a pool of money to reanalyze clinical data based on gender. And so these data sets exist, and they'll do this work. And she was giving me a couple of examples of how, there's certain drugs that get approved because they meet the endpoints. But if you actually dissect, by gender, men are benefiting from the drug and women are either neutral or negative. And so it's really interesting when you start to do some analysis on it. And so kind of one thing in that kind of time frame is can we learn more about that with data we already have? And then can we start to treat differently with that, or not? The answer might be you shouldn't take this, or that's not right for you, or or it's dangerous, or so that's one thing. Just because that's been on my mind since I had this conversation. It was pretty interesting. Actually, if anyone has data sets, you should. I'll tell you who they are. The other thing that I find really frustrating is. People ask me, like, I mean, I have a PhD, I do not have an MD, but people ask me questions like, you know, if you had like a hard adolescence, like period, a lot of pain or something, do you think that might foreshadow your menopause symptoms? And I'm like, I don't know, but we should have that information. That is knowable. That is just a woman's like lived experience. So I am personally very interested about this longitudinal hormonal health trajectory on how, you know, from kind of onset of period through menopause and kind of everything in between, you know, our hormones are dictating a lot of our health. And I don't think we really have that data. And so personally, I think if we had it or if we could start to collect it, I think that could help maybe bridge the big data sets that we do have, like clinical trial data, you know, medical records, payer data. It might start to like be the thread that starts to connect some of this. So,
so scientific unlocks, harvesting what we have and what we could have in order to really accelerate the field.
Like jump over some
Exactly. So Nisha, 20.
I guess if in 5 years from now, I imagine JPM here, or maybe 4 years from now, I would love for our meetings with the biotech ecosystem to be at least 25% on women's health assets. That would be incredible. Like just because that would mean that the fueling is working. That would mean our VC friends are also putting money into the system. Policies are changing. We're just all moving together in the right path towards getting drugs approved.
Great.
That would be my.
Well, thank you all. I think we all feel the imperative for women's health, for our mothers, for our sisters, for our friends, for our daughters. And I think we're all motivated to rally this community that is really exceptional across philanthropy, biotech, pharma, venture, and government to really ensure that we're accelerating this field. So thank you for this discussion, and looking forward to future JPMs and really having these conversations again at a much more mature state. So thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.